So the question is, how do you respond when you walk through a really tough storm? In Mark chapter 4, we see the disciples in a boat crossing over, because that's what Jesus said they needed to do, cross over the lake, go to the other side. But while they were crossing over, this huge storm comes and it totally disrupts their pattern or where they're going, what they're heading. Seems like it's going to be the end. In fact, it's such a huge squall, they actually think they're going to die. So it's a pretty intense storm. And then they go down below, find Jesus completely asleep. Now, the big thing of what we've been reading about in our reading plan this week is just about being at rest, how to be at rest in life, how to be at rest in the promises of God. And so for the disciples and Jesus, they were walking in obedience because their assignment was to get to the other side. And I think Jesus rested with an assurance, knowing that the promise would be fulfilled, that as they're walking in obedience, man, that God's going to make sure they get to the other side, because that's the assignment that he has for them, and nothing's going to stop them. I think Jesus also is asleep and is at rest in the boat because he remembers and realizes that he has the authority and the power to control those things. Like, the unseen realm doesn't destroy, distract, or detour Christ. He has the authority to bring God's heaven, God's authority into action here on the earth, which is how he walked and saw so many people healed and did the miracles that he did, because he knew the authority that he walked in, that God had given to him, which, side note, he gives to all of us who believe as well. And you can see that because the disciples go to wake Jesus up and they say, man, God, don't you care? We're gonna die. And Jesus goes and he rebukes the wind and the waves, calms down, there's peace. And then he says, man, why do you doubt? Where's your faith? Is your faith still not in God who can do all things? And I love it because it's not so much a rebuke to the disciples, but it's an indicator to us that Jesus is telling the disciples, and he tells us, hey, listen, you can have faith to overcome these kinds of situations, these kinds of circumstances, these kinds of storms. They don't have to be the final word. But what really struck me was a couple things. Number one, I thought it was interesting that the disciples' first response when they were walking through something beyond their control was to assume, perhaps even be offended, that they were certain that God didn't care, that Jesus just didn't care about them. I mean, they were walking, Jesus was right there in person, and their assumption was he must not care. Why? Because he wasn't getting worked up the way they were getting worked up. But you have to remember, Jesus knew and had a different perspective than they did. Faith looks a little different. When you're walking in faith, other people might assume something about you, but you don't have to walk with it. No, you can walk with confidence in the storm. And I thought it was interesting that their first response was to just blame God and attack his character, thinking he must not love them because the storm was happening, which wasn't the case at all, because he actually had the power to deliver them from the storm, which he also did. But what the thing that really struck me this morning was how in Mark 4, we're reading that Jesus got up from his place of rest. He rebuked the wind and the waves, and there was peace. Peace showed up because Jesus was there. But Jesus didn't respond, and Jesus didn't rebuke the waves, and he didn't do this miracle because there was a problem. That's not what motivated Jesus. It wasn't the result. It wasn't the, hey, I'm going to do this and we're going to write about it years later. It wasn't any of those things that was motivating Jesus. It wasn't the result or the very storm itself that Jesus was reacting to. Jesus got up and rebuked the wind and the waves because he loved the disciples. Because they were in a vulnerable place. They were in a place of fear. They were in a place of frustration. And Jesus loved them so much that he got up and he rebuked. He got up from his nap, made a sacrifice because he loved the disciples. The very thing they assumed that he didn't do, love and care, he got up because he loved and cared. Never addressed it, never said, guys, don't you get it by now? I love you so much. No, he just got up, let his actions do it. And I love it because when we're walking through storms, God's going to respond not because we're whining, not because we're worrying, and not because we're wavering around. He's not going to do it because of that. He's not going to do it to show off. He's going to do it because he loves us. And so I wanted to remind you today that if you're walking through a storm, God's going to come through. God is with you. He hasn't left you. He hasn't abandoned you. He hasn't given up. And he loves you enough to respond to your storm. Hey, I hope this has been encouraging for you. Thanks for letting me just talk it out. I love to meditate out loud on God's word on these things. And I hope it helps you have some faith for today. We'll talk to you soon.